So yeah, this talk is about infiltrating Kubernetes. My name is Magno Logan. I work for Trend Micro Research. So thanks everyone for joining and for staying until the end. I know it's hard, the second day. Thank you for the organizers. And this is my first time attending and speaking at BlackAlps. So thanks for having me. So before I start, just a little bit about myself. My name is Magno Logan. I'm originally from Brazil, but I live in Canada for the past 5 years. I actually lived in Geneva for 1 year a long time ago, but my French is not good, so I won't even try. But yeah, I'm a part of a cloud and container security research team at Trend Micro. We call ourselves a Nebula team. And I'm also an instructor for secure coding and DevSecOps for this company called Go Hacking, in Brazil. And this QR code, if you want to scan it, it's just taking you to my LinkedIn. If you want to talk to me, that's the best way to reach out to me later. If not, there is also like a bit.ly link. But if you don't trust me, then just go to LinkedIn and search for Magno Logan. It's fine. Okay. So this is the agenda for this talk, right? I can't talk about Kubernetes security without giving you an overview of how Kubernetes works. So we're going to understand some basic components and the architecture of Kubernetes. Then I'm going to talk about the MITRE attack framework, specifically the one for containers. If you haven't heard about it, you probably heard about MITRE, but maybe not the container matrix. And then I'm going to present two scenarios. I'm going to describe them specifically, how I did it when I started doing Kubernetes research back in 2020 and what I've learned in the past few years. One is an example of a honeypot that we deployed and we analyzed attackers leveraging that honeypot. And another one is from a threat actor group called Team TNT. And lastly, I'll talk about a few countermeasures, few tools and best practices for, protecting your Kubernetes environment. Who here has a Kubernetes running production? Show of hands. Okay, a few people. Good. Who here has played with Kubernetes? More. Okay. Who here has heard about Kubernetes before? Last one. Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, so when I started this journey, I basically didn't have a lot of knowledge around Kubernetes. I had a little bit of knowledge around Docker, but not so much. So I started kind of digging through internet and blogs and articles and videos and collecting as much information as I could. And when I started doing this, all my notes was saved in a text file. And I was, okay, yeah, this is good, but maybe this will be helpful for other people as well. So I created this project on GitHub called the Awesome Kubernetes Security List. You probably heard about the Awesome list before. So this list has a bunch of materials, links for articles, videos, PDFs, certifications, and all kinds of things related to Kubernetes and Kubernetes security. And the first item there, it's specifically about the basics, right? How Kubernetes works, what is Kubernetes. So the link is the red one there. If you want to, fork it, if you want to send a pull request, feel free, but there's a lot of material there for you to start your Kubernetes journey as well. And also, we just published this latest article that I wrote called The Deep Dive into Kubernetes Threat Modeling. So analyzing each of the components of a Kubernetes cluster and how attackers could be able to compromise those components, how they would exploit those there as well. And there are a few other blog posts around Kubernetes from a few years ago as well. Okay. So if you haven't heard about Kubernetes, if you don't really understand how it works, this is the main slide for this talk. This is very important because these are the main components of a Kubernetes cluster. So I'm going to explain them each one, in trying to describe them in detail and in a way that's easy to understand. So we have two main components here. We have the control plane, which used to be called the master node on the left, and we have worker nodes, which are the free on the right there, free components as well. Each node think it's a server, it's a machine. It could be a virtual machine, a C2 instance, Azure, virtual machine, whatever. It's a server, okay? And inside those two main components, let's start with the control plane here. The control plane, as the name says, is the component, the main component that controls the Kubernetes cluster, right? It's making sure that the Kubernetes is achieving what it's called a desired state. What does that mean? It means that whatever is described in the configuration of the cluster should be reflected in the cluster. So let's say I want 3 containers of my Nginx image. The desired state will take care of that and make sure that you have 3 containers running on your cluster. Okay? So, as you can see here, in the center of the control plane, there is one main component called the Kube API server. And the Kube API server, as the name says, is a REST API server, right? That it's responsible for exposing and receiving all the API calls for the cluster. And as you can see, it's a central component because it talks to all the components from the control plane and also with the components from the worker nodes. On the bottom left here, we have the etcd. etcd is just a key value store, a database for all your Kubernetes objects. All your configuration for your cluster is saved on etcd. It saves information such as which nodes are part of the cluster, and which resources are available in the cluster as well. On the top left side of the control plane, we have the Kube Controller Manager. Any managers around here? Right? Show of hands? No? Good. Okay. I always make this bad joke, so sorry about that in advance, but the Kube Controller Manager, as any manager, doesn't do much. Sorry. It just has some subcomponents that do the work for him. So you have like the pod controller, the service controller, and everything that's inside the controller manager handling these objects and make sure that whatever is defined on etcd is reflected on the worker nodes. And the cloud controller manager, right, is the one that interacts with the cloud providers. So if you need things such as like a disk volume or a load balancer, the cloud control manager will be the one handling that. If you're using like unmanaged Kubernetes cluster, which means that you're creating that from scratch, or if you're using the managed solutions such as EKS, AKS, GKE, and others from cloud providers. Okay, so that talks to the cloud. Okay, that's the control plane. And these are usually running, like if in an unmanaged cluster, they're usually running as containers, right, inside that cluster. On the right side there, we have the worker nodes. So the worker nodes have each 3 main components: the kubelet, the kube proxy, and the computer there represents the container runtime engine. The kubelet is the agent, right, of the cluster. It's responsible for managing and the containers that are executing on each node, and it's also sending information, health information back to the Kube API server. The kube proxy, it's handling the network. So either the internal network inside the cluster or external access as well. And the container runtime engine is the actually the engine that deploys and it starts the container, right? It used to be Docker and now it's containerd by default. Any questions around that? Okay. I'll leave, I know we have questions at the end, but this is very important. Okay. These are some of the ports that are open when you create a Kubernetes cluster. Some of them are on the control plane node, as I mentioned, and others are in the worker nodes. Remember this port here, 10250, because it's going to be important later once we go into the scenarios as well. So this is the kubelet API. So not just the API server has an API, but the etcd has an API, and the kubelet has an API. So you have 3 APIs here inside your Kubernetes cluster. Technically, only the kube API server API should be exposed, but there are some issues that can happen here. Okay? Yeah, you see there. The first one's the Kubernetes API server, etcd, client API, and kubelet API. So these are important there. Okay, so after this overview, I need to talk about the MITRE ATT&CK framework, but specifically the MITRE ATT&CK for containers. So you probably heard about the MITRE ATT&CK framework before. It's this global access knowledge base of tactics and techniques that attackers leverage in real world scenarios, right? You want to understand that, and it can be used for offensive security, for simulating adversaries, or it can be used for blue team for preventing against adversarial attacks. But until a few years ago, we didn't have a matrix for containers. So in December 2020, I know it's a little bit hard to read, but I'll tell you the story here, what happened. In December 2020, MITRE published this blog post asking for help for the community, for the industry, about, okay, can you provide us data and any kind of real-world information that would be able for us to create this MITRE ATT&CK for containers? So we reached out to MITRE there the next day, December 18th, and we provided them with some links and also data from our honeypots, because we had, prior to that, we had deployed Docker and Kubernetes honeypots and collected a lot of data around that. And in the beginning of 2021, April 2021, the first version of the attack for containers was released, and it's still updated until today. So just a brief timeline here. MITRE asked for help. We reached out the next day. We provided our data and input, our feedback from the draft reviews, and then it was released in 2021. What's interesting about that is the 25% of the MITRE attack for container techniques were contributed by us, by our research. So I think that's really cool. And evidence of attacks were known to us based on our honeypots as early as 2018. So we knew it even before that. So this is a final version or current version of the MITRE attack for containers. If you haven't seen it before, it describes, right, the tactics and techniques that attackers, threat actors are using, right, in real world scenarios to compromise applications that are leveraging Docker, containers, Kubernetes, any kind of containerized application. These are the ones that we contributed here, and with the sub-techniques as well. But just a quick note that what's important here when I start talking about infiltrating Kubernetes, you can see that there aren't a lot of techniques for initial access. So the 3 main ways here, according to the attack framework, to compromise a Kubernetes cluster are exploiting a public-facing application, meaning you have an application running inside a container, inside a pod, and it's running inside the Kubernetes cluster, and that application is exposed and it's vulnerable, and someone compromises that application. External remote services, that can be either the kube API server, which is generally exposed. If the cluster is misconfigured, that can happen. Also, the previous Kubernetes dashboard that was enabled by default in previous versions, that led to some attacks as well, some compromises. For example, Tesla was compromised a few years back because they exposed their dashboard as well. And of course, valid accounts, valid credentials, right? If you have the proper credential to that cluster, then there's not much that it can happen here. Okay. So the first attack scenario, we decided to create our own Kubernetes honeypot. And basically, what I did was, okay, I need to install a legitimate application to sound, okay, that the cluster has stuff that it's being used in production or something like that. So I decided to go with the Drupal content management system, and I use version 8.5.0, which has a remote command execution vulnerability. How long do you think it took after we deployed the honeypot for the attackers to compromise that honeypot? Anyone? Any guesses? Less than 24 hours. Less than 24 hours, they were able to compromise the cluster because of the RCE, and then break out of the cluster as well because the cluster was misconfigured, and then they were able to, access the cloud account. But of course, we were monitoring that, and we prevented that from happening because we didn't want to get a huge cloud bill as well. But this is what happened, right? The app application vulnerability that was exploited, it was the CVE 2018-7600. The exploit here, it's available on GitHub, is just like run the exploit with the target application. So we expose the Drupal application via a load balancer, but we didn't post anywhere. So it was like a long URL from the cloud provider, and we didn't publish anywhere. How did they find it? They are constantly monitoring Kubernetes cluster and, of course, scanning the internet, services like Shodan and Sensis and others. They're constantly monitoring that as well. And after they got a shell inside one of the pods, right, we call the pod, it's like the smallest unit of a Kubernetes cluster. It can have one or more containers running inside. And then via this app RC vulnerability, they got a shell there. After that, they try to escalate privileges, right? Perform privilege escalation or lateral movement. So here are some of the techniques that they try to use or to find out, and that you can also leverage yourself to find out that you are in a Kubernetes environment. So this internal reconnaissance, inspecting the Kubernetes environment, how do you know once you get a shell in a box, how do you know that you are in a VM or a container in a Kubernetes cluster? How do you know that? So the first thing is looking for environment variables. If you search for environment variables with Kube, you're probably going to find, if you find that you have information about the Kube API server IP address and the Kube API server port, that indicates that, okay, you're probably running in a Kubernetes cluster. Another thing is the service account token. Every pod running on the cluster will have this service account token, and it will be always in that same location. var run secrets kubernetes.io service account, and then you're going to have the namespace, which is basically like a folder inside your Kubernetes cluster, a separation of different projects, the namespace. You're going to have the token and the certificate inside that folder. So that can give you information because that's used by the kubelet to talk to the Kube API server and to perform authentication there as well. There are some tools, open source tools, for example, MI Contained. It's available on GitHub. It's a tool developed by Jesse Frizzell, and it's like a container introspection tool. So if you download it and run it inside your container, that will tell you if you're running inside a containerized environment, which one it is, and it's helpful not just for the attackers, but also for you if you're doing pen testing or analyzing your own Kubernetes cluster. Okay. So after this honeypot, we started getting a lot of, not just this one, but many attacks in our honeypots. We started getting like the same attacks over and over again. And we started analyzing or tracing it back to this threat actor called Team TNT. They are already listed on the MITRE attack framework as well, right? Which has a list of groups of threat actors. And this is a group that usually attacks Docker, Kubernetes, and cloud environments. And what's interesting about this group, we did a thorough research about them. Two colleagues from my team published a white paper, I think last year or 2 years ago, detailing all their techniques, all the attacks. It's a 40-page white paper with a lot of information about them. Some interesting things for us here to note are that we believe that at least some of the members of the Triactor groups are native German speakers, as their script and text, including posts on social media, are written in fluent German. So I know there are some German friends around here, so maybe you know them. Just kidding. And the actors behind the TMTNT profile themselves, like on Twitter, they either profile themselves as like honest robbers who mean no harm, as red team penetration testers, often teasing security researchers in the process. So they were very active on Twitter a while ago. Now it's less. Lately, after we published this white paper, they went dark, at least for a few months, I guess. But yeah, here are some of the MO or modus operandi of the techniques that they leverage, right? They use known scanners, known tools. We're gonna see a few of these tools here. But basically, they scan their targets, they list their targets, they look for exploitable security weaknesses. So they look for things like the Docker daemon API expose. They look for applications with common vulnerabilities, such as the one I mentioned in my honeypot. They look for that, and they compromise. Most of the attack, if not all, is automated. It's all scripted, right? So they don't touch the keyboard. It's always scripted. It's always looking for these vulnerable servers to compromise. And not just TMTNT, but 95 to 99%, I can say that from my experience, of the attacks in these environments, Docker, Kubernetes, cloud, the end goal is usually crypto mining, right? They usually deploy the crypto miner, run it as much as they can before they get detected, and they get free money, okay? I did a research also around GitHub Actions and how they exploited, not TMTNT, but other attackers exploited that for free money as well. So again, yeah, scan results, exploitable security weakness, payload delivery, and get the victim, start mining cryptocurrencies. How did we find this? How we were able to describe this in such detail was because we found one of their command and control servers and were able to access and download a bunch of the files that were available there. One of these files was a shell script for their whole attack. So during this, inside this shell script, it had the CSC, this command and control, which they used as an ERC bot, right? And they had three variants. They have the variant A, which is a binary download, source code compilation, or base64 encoding. So this is all described on the white paper, and we're gonna cover the variant C, the one that they leverage the command and control to compromise almost 50,000 Kubernetes nodes, right? So when I talk about node, it's one machine inside the cluster. It's not the whole cluster itself. So this attack is described in this article as well that I published a few years ago. It's nearly 50,000 because how do we know this? As we had access to their C2 server, there was basically a text file with a list of IP addresses after it was compromised. And we can see that in the script as well, once we analyze it here. Most of these nodes, most of these servers inside the Kubernetes cluster, they were exposed in China, more than half of them, a few in the United States, 5% in France, and 4% in Germany, and so on and so forth. So you can see that there are a lot of exposed Kubernetes or vulnerable Kubernetes clusters in China. The script that we analyzed, the shell script, was called kube.lateral.sh. And the first time we analyzed it, we submitted to VirusTotal. It only had 6 detections. What does the script do? The script disables bash history. It creates these environment variables for the C2, command and control, the script to install the crypto miner and the binary of the Monero XMRig, right? It creates a random folder, with random numbers. The name of the folder are like 3 random generated numbers inside the temp. And they also gather user information and system via some common Linux commands. Besides that, as I said, they leverage open source tools. So tools that you probably heard about it before, MassScan, for it's a mass IP port scanner available on GitHub. But what's interesting was they're using zgrab, a banner grabbing tool that was deprecated. So it's outdated. There's a new version of zgrab. When I did this research already, there is a zgrab tool. But even attackers are using outdated tools. So it's not just us. So when your boss complains, you can say, okay, see, the attackers are also using outdated stuff. So it's fine. Just kidding. This is the command and control, the IRC-bot. It's like, it's base64 encoded, as I mentioned, right? And then it's transferred to a kubec file. It's based on the Kaitain, or IRC-bot. And after that, right, they compile the file. They move to the root as .cube to sound legitimate. Who here would remove this file from the root folder? Nobody, right? You think, okay, I'm gonna break everything. No, right? That's how they try to sound legitimate. How do we know? One of the indicators that this was TMTNT, right? If you can see here in the kubec file, these are one of the URLs for their IRC servers. irc.tmtnt.red. Okay, the main file, or kind of the main portion that's related to Kubernetes is this one. This is a function inside the kubelateral.sh called kubepawn. I know it's a little bit hard to read, but I referenced the main points there, and I'll describe them here. So the first red arrow there is using, so they already compromise your network. And why the file is called kubelateral.sh? Because they are doing a lateral movement inside your network to look for Kubernetes clusters. They are specifically looking for the kubelet API running on port 10250. Remember that from the beginning? Okay. So this is what they're doing. Mass scan in the kubelet, looking for the kubelet port. After that, right, the second arrow there, they're using, and I have some slides as well to demonstrate here. They're using this running pods endpoint inside the cluster. So I had to, I'll go back, but I had to look through the Kubernetes code, Golang in Kubernetes on GitHub, to understand what they're doing, because this API is not very well documented. So I had to look, okay, what is this running pods inside the kubelet? So there is a file there from the kubelet called server.go. And if you look at running pods, and you see that running pods endpoint is used for testing only, but it's available in production. And if you see the running pods, returns a list of pods running on the kubelet. So if I access this endpoint on that kubelet, on that server, it's going to tell me what all the containers that are running on that node, on that server. I did some experimentation also online, just looking for exposed Kubernetes clusters on Shodan, and scanning their kubelet port at 10.2050, I got these 3 results. So 401, unauthorized, good. photo free, forbidden, but it still tells me from the error message here, or the response message, that this is a Kubernetes cluster. It's very specific to Kubernetes. And the 200, where they had no authentication on the kubelet, and I was allowed to list the containers running on the node without any authentication whatsoever. Okay? Going back to the kubepwn function, you see the third arrow there. There is a curl to their C2 server where they say kube in.php target the IP address. That was the file that we accessed to count 50,000, almost 50,000 IP addresses. We were able to collect this file as well. And then every other curl command here, it's to the kubelet API as well. But now it's a different endpoint. It's /run endpoint, and then you have namespace, pod name, container name. So as I said, each pod can have one or more containers inside, and they are kind of organized by namespaces, and they're running a number of commands. So for each one of the containers inside that node, they're updating the packages, they are installing some tools like bash, curl, wget, and then they're downloading and executing the crypto miner at the end. That's temp.x1mr, x2mr. Why did we say that this is a worm-like attack or worm-like behavior? Because they don't stop there. They look at the IP ranges, the private IP ranges. So they look across all your network and they try to exploit as many kubelets and Kubernetes clusters as possible. So they scan all that and they run a kubepwn function for all those ranges. So that's why we said that. The run command, if I didn't show it here, but it's another endpoint from the kubelet API that it's not well documented, at least it wasn't before, that allows you, basically here, handles requests to run a command inside the container. So through the kubelet API, I can tell the kubelet to run a command inside that container. And that's what they're doing here in this bunch of curl requests at the end. Okay? Okay, this is a problem, right? This is a problem. If you have your kubelet exposed like I showed here, people can list the containers that are running. I know it might not seem like much, but can give them information about what containers are running there and maybe the version of your Kubernetes cluster as well through the Kube API server. Things like that can lead your cluster to be compromised. So how do I fix it? What are some of the countermeasures or best practices to protect a Kubernetes cluster? I really believe in this approach I call the Kubernetes security triad. Just like what you have for AppSec, you have like SAST, DAST, and SCA. These ones are the main types or categories of tools that you should have if you're leveraging Kubernetes cluster. The first one is image scanning. Sorry. Image scanning means scanning your images before you run them in production, scanning them for vulnerabilities, if they are using the latest update packages and patches, all that stuff, right? You can scan your images during your build process on your pipeline, or you can scan your images when you upload them when you push them to your registry. Preferably your private registry. So you can use tools such as like Trivy, Claire, even the new one, Docker Scout, for example. Sneak also helps there. I'm not going to talk about like the tools itself. It's very straightforward, but this is important. Most of the time, to fix these problems, the vulnerabilities inside the tools, it's either updating the image version or removing unused packages. So if you can start with a minimal base image for your applications, that helps a lot reducing that problem or fixing that problem. So the first one, image scanning. Second one, admission controller. As the name says, admission controller controls the admission inside the cluster. So it's a component. There are some native admission controllers from Kubernetes, but you can also use third-party tools. So think of the admission controller as the bouncer of a nightclub. He decides who enters and who doesn't enter in the cluster. So basically what you can do is, if my container image hasn't been scanned, don't allow that image inside the cluster. If my container image has a critical vulnerability, don't allow the image inside the cluster. So you block that image from running inside the cluster. That's why the name admission controller. And the third one, some examples for admission controller can be just the regular from the native ones from Kubernetes, but you can also use third-party tools such as OPA, Open Policy Agent, and Gatekeeper, or Kyverno. They're both CNCF tools, same as Kubernetes is. And runtime protection is, okay, after you deploy your pods, after you deploy your containers, how do you know that they haven't been compromised? How do you know that this is not happening inside your cluster? Right? How do you detect that? So runtime protection is basically monitoring the runtime, making sure that there is no drift. We call drift detection as well, making sure that whatever is running inside the cluster is the same what was defined in the image. There's nothing else that was changed and nothing else that was installed, such as packages or updates were performed after the container is running. A famous runtime protection tool for containers is called Falco. It's also from the CNCF, but you can leverage enterprise solutions as well if you want. Lastly, but not least, some basic security measures. I know it may sound cliche. It's like standard approach for general cybersecurity as well, but it's very important. It's important to remember. So updating your Kubernetes environment early and often. There are free Kubernetes versions published or released every year. Used to be 4, now it's only 3, so that's good. But you need to keep them up to date. Don't use the cluster admin, which is kind of the root user of the cluster, for your daily work. You have to treat them like root. So you don't use root daily. Don't use cluster admin inside your cluster work. If you can, use managed Kubernetes service providers, such as AKS, EKS, GKE, and others, right? I'm not saying which one is better than the other, but the kind of the benefit here of using a managed Kubernetes service is because they take care of the control plane security. They handle all those components on the left side of the architecture that I showed. They handle that for you. You only need to take care of your worker nodes and your applications. Okay? That's better. There is a Kubernetes CIS benchmark as well. So there's one for unmanaged Kubernetes. There's one for EKS, AKS, and JKE. So they give you like best practices on how to set up and how to harden your cluster as well. And there's even a tool from Aqua called KubeBench to validate those best practices in your cluster. And yeah, just remember, Kubernetes is not secure by default. There is a lot of work to do after you deploy your Kubernetes cluster before you start running in production. And that's it. Thank you for listening, and I'm open to any questions.